my billionaire father's mistress, and my mother got pregnant at the exact same time. My father, Richard Sinclair, constantly promised that his entire empire would belong to me. Yet, in reality, every ounce of his affection went to his mistress, Isla. Determined to secure my birthright, I turned my mother's womb into a relentless training ground in my first life. I exercised, flipped, and forced myself to absorb every bit of prenatal education. I did not rest for a single second, but my frantic overactivity proved fatal. The umbilical cord wrapped tightly around my neck, suffocating me. The sheer stress of my struggle caused my mother to hemorrhage and pass away during childbirth. Just like that, my father's entire fortune fell into the lap of his newborn illegitimate daughter. Even the Grim Reaper took pity on my tragic end. Before sending my soul back in time, he offered me a single piece of cosmic wisdom: just lay flat. As my consciousness drifted back into the warm, dark amniotic fluid, I suddenly heard a sharp, arrogant voice echoing in my mind. It was my unborn half-sister, Madeline. So, what if she is the legitimate firstborn? Father loves children who strive for greatness. If I start working hard right now, I will steal all his affection. The entire inheritance will be mine. I mentally shrugged, blowing a few bubbles in the dark. Fine by me. Knock yourself out, sis. I am going to lie back and enjoy the ride. Let us see whose hands the fortune ends up in this time. Right now, we were in a luxury maternity recovery suite. My father was casually dismissing my mother's tears. Eleanor, I don't care about that woman. Once she gives birth, I'll pay her off, keep the baby, and send her away. My legacy belongs to our daughter. Just focus on resting and stop making a scene. That was what he said. But to keep an eye on his beloved mistress, he completely ignored my mother's dignity and moved Isla into the suite right next door. Separated by a single wall, I could hear every single thought running through Madeline's mind. Why is father still wasting time with that old hag? I need to get his attention fast. 1, 2, 3, kick. I'm going to dance my heart out. A moment later, Isla's delighted voice carried through the wall. Richard, come quickly. The baby is dancing in my tummy. My father rushed over without a second thought. Look at that rhythm. She actually reacts to Mozart. She is going to be a prodigy. Seeing the sharp movements beneath Isla's skin, my father beamed with pride, as expected of a child of Richard Sinclair, showing such talent before she is even born. With a wave of his hand, he wired Isla $50,000 on the spot, telling her to hire the best prenatal music tutor money could buy. Madeline became even more enthusiastic in her womb. Thank you, Daddy. Watch me drop some beats. Boom clap, boom clap. That useless Penelope must be green with envy. So, what if she is the legitimate daughter? She can't even compare to my pinky toe. As her internal monologue grew louder and more obnoxious, I figuratively covered my ears and rolled my eyes in the amniotic fluid. In my last life, I was exactly like her. Desperate for a scrap of my father's attention, I turned the womb into a relentless training camp, kicking and flipping to prove my worth, never giving my mother a moment of peace. The result? I strangled myself and bled my mother to death in the delivery room. I did not care if the Grim Reaper's advice to lay flat actually worked. I was simply done trying so hard. Hearing the laughter next door, my mother's resentment boiled over. Trying to win back her husband, she called out, Richard, our daughter is dancing to the music too. Come look. She gently stroked her stomach, whispering desperately to me, Sweetheart, we can't let that mistress's child outshine us. For the sake of your father's billions, please move a little. Sensing my father was about to leave, Madeline kicked Isla's uterine wall with all her might. Cry. Pretend it hurts. Do whatever it takes to keep father here. Father's eyes belong on me. I won't let Penelope steal my spotlight. Isla gasped in genuine pain, clutching her belly. Richard, it hurts. Please stay with me. My father still held some lingering hope for me. After a moment's hesitation, he stepped back into my mother's room. Is Penelope dancing too? Let me see what she can do. He rested his palm on my mother's swollen belly. She forced a smile. Yes, she was just moving around so beautifully. Penelope, darling, be a good girl and show your father. Seeing the desperate, humiliated look on my mother's face broke my heart. But remembering the Reaper's words, I steeled myself and remained completely still. No matter how much my mother coaxed, I did not budge. I closed my eyes and drifted off to sleep. In the heavy, awkward silence, the expectation in my father's eyes withered into disappointment. It seems Penelope simply lacks Madeline's spark. The moment he walked out of the room, my mother let out a tearful sigh, reprimanding me under her breath. Penelope, why are you so stubborn? Your father clearly favors Madeline. If you don't show him what you can do, that girl will strip us of everything we own. But before she could finish, a sharp scream echoed from next door. Ah, it hurts. I can't take this. Stop moving, baby. Please call a doctor. Isla was sobbing, thrashing around the bed in agony. The sheer violence of the noise left my mother stunned. Slowly, she looked down at her own peaceful stomach and let out a breathless, relieved laugh. My sweet girl. You really do love your mother, don't you? You didn't want me to suffer. Fine, if you don't want to move, don't move. As long as we both make it through this healthy, that is all that matters. Madeline did not care about Isla's physical limits. Driven by her obsession with outperforming me, she kicked even harder. You don't understand, mother. Penelope was trying to steal my spotlight. I have to work harder. I need father to see that I am the chosen one, the only true heir to his empire. The more Isla screamed, the faster Madeline thrashed. My father, utterly blinded by his own pride, completely ignored his mistress's agony. She clearly inherited my superior genes. Such strength, such vigor. Prenatal movement is perfectly natural, Isla. Stop being so dramatic. Listening to the endless wails through the wall, I smiled to myself. Keep going, Madeline. Work yourself into a tight little knot. Let us see how much you like having the umbilical cord wrapped around your throat. Isla eventually blacked out from the sheer intensity of the pain. As the corridor outside filled with the chaotic sounds of rushing doctors, I snuggled closer to my mother's warm uterine wall, fully committing to my life of leisure. Don't worry, Mom. In this life, I am not going to let you suffer. From that day on, Madeline fully embraced her life as a prenatal overachiever. With 4 months left before our birth, she decided to start her body management routine. I must control my appetite from the womb. I will reject all unnecessary calories. Father will definitely prefer a daughter with a perfect figure. Once Penelope balloons into a chubby pig, I will stun everyone with my gorgeous silhouette. She punched Isla's stomach to induce nausea, preventing her from keeping any food down. Within weeks, Isla looked skeletal, her skin dry, and her eyes hollow. Meanwhile, my mother enjoyed every single meal. Because I was quiet and content, her appetite was fantastic. She ate rich, healthy soups and fresh fruits, and her skin began to glow with radiant health. But Madeline only thought it was hilarious. Keep stuffing your faces. Once you're as fat as a pig, father will dump you. I hope Penelope gets so massive that she causes a fatal birth obstruction. While Isla starved, Madeline was also pushing herself through an extreme workout regimen. At 5 in the morning, while my mother and I were still happily sleeping, Isla would be jolted awake by violent movements in her belly. An hour of stretching, an hour of yoga, and then 100 backflips. I will show father that Penelope does nothing but eat and sleep, while I am overflowing with drive. I am the rightful heir. After her flips, she would immediately begin dancing along with the prenatal music tutor. In our suite, my mother and I would wake up late, enjoy a hearty breakfast, do some gentle breathing exercises, and then lounge on the balcony to soak up the morning sun. Isla watched us from her window with pure envy. But the moment she tried to rest, Madeline would pull on her umbilical cord to force her back up. Don't drag me down. Read those English flashcards to me. We need to get the inheritance. Isla survived entirely on 4 fluids, her body trembling with exhaustion. My father, though repulsed by Isla's withered state, was increasingly amazed by Madeline's constant activity. She is absorbing the very essence of your vitality, Isla. This child is destined for greatness. But when he looked at me, his face fell. Penelope is my firstborn, but she is completely lifeless. She has no reaction to music or languages, and she is 3 pounds heavier than Madeline. If she remains this lazy, I will have to reconsider my estate planning. My mother defended me fiercely. My daughter is gentle and perfect. She made my pregnancy a dream. If you're biased, just say so. My father only shook his head, his eyes cold. I simply turned over and went back to sleep. The game was far from over. Soon, the day of our final prenatal checkup arrived. Even my grandparents were shocked when they saw Isla's state. How did you become so skeletal? Can you even deliver a healthy baby like this? Isla opened her mouth to speak, but only dry heaved. The grandparents turned away in disgust, looking at my mother instead. Now, Eleanor knows how to nurture a pregnancy. Look at her glowing skin. That is what a healthy heir looks like. Madeline was furious. What do you old fools know? I'm slender, so I can slide right out. Penelope is going to get stuck. When she is struggling, I will trigger an early labor, climb out first, and claim the crown. During the ultrasound, Madeline forced herself to turn around and wave her tiny hand at the screen, completely ignoring the fact that the umbilical cord was already wrapped around her neck 3 times. My grandparents gasped in delight. A prodigy. She is communicating with us. This level of intelligence belongs to our future leader. My father was beaming with pride. I agree. Her due date is 2 weeks after Penelope's, but if she could just come earlier, I would make her my firstborn. Madeline was ecstatic. You should have said so earlier, Daddy. An early birth? I can do that. Watch me. I'm coming out right now to claim my title. Suddenly, Isla gasped, clutching her abdomen as she collapsed to the floor. My water broke. I think the baby is coming. Madeline was fully committed to her stunt. Before Isla's cervix could even dilate, she began violently forcing her way down the birth canal. Just a little more push, and father's billions are mine. Seeing Isla lose consciousness from the sudden, massive hemorrhage, my father panicked, lifting her and rushing toward the delivery room. My grandparents ran close behind. My mother was left standing in the hallway, her face pale. Penelope, is she really going to be born first and take everything from us? My heart sank. The plan was changing. Now that Madeline was forcing her way out, I couldn't just stay passive anymore. I checked my position. My head was down, my body strong, and my limbs were fully developed. I decided to move. My mother gasped, clutching her stomach as a massive contraction hit her. At the exact same time, Madeline's thoughts next door grew faint and desperate. I'm so hungry. I can't push. Cough. Why is there so much blood rushing into my mouth?
I'm choking.
And this cord, why is it so tight? Hearing her struggle, my hope flared. I used my strong, healthy limbs to push myself downward. Suddenly, my father walked into our room, tossing a thick document onto my mother's bed. Sign the divorce papers, Eleanor. You'll get a generous settlement, but Penelope won't touch a dime of my fortune. My mother stared at him, tears welling in her eyes. But my water broke too. I'm about to give birth. My father looked at her with utter indifference. Madeline is coming out. She is my finest child, and I won't let anyone question her status. I will make sure she is my legitimate firstborn. He forced a pen into her hand. Heartbroken and exhausted, my mother prepared to sign.
Fine, I'll sign.
From now on, she has nothing to do with you. I kicked frantically against her ribs. Mom, don't give up. Madeline is choking in there. She hasn't won yet. My father glanced toward the door, a smug smile on his face. Don't blame me, Eleanor. Blame Penelope for being useless. She couldn't even beat Madeline to the finish line. Madeline's thoughts echoed weakly. Almost there, push. I will be the billionaire heiress. Daddy is going to love me so much. Penelope will never stand a chance. I struggled to push, but my mother was too devastated to help. I found myself stuck in the birth canal, unable to move. Was everything going to end up in Madeline's hands again? Just as my mother's hand began to write her name, a panicked scream echoed from the delivery room next door. Oh my God, the baby is in danger. The scream from next door tore through the clinical stillness of the VIP maternity ward like jagged glass. Fetal heart rate is plummeting. Bradycardia. It's down to 50. We need an emergency crash C-section right now. Where is the hemorrhage coming from? The placenta is detaching. Prep the OR. For move. My father froze. The fountain pen in his hand hovered above the mahogany nightstand, the sleek gold nib trembling against the crisp corner of the divorce
Decree.
For months, Richard Sinclair had convinced himself that he had engineered the perfect heir. He had stood over Isla's bed, listening to the frantic, erratic thumping against her stretched skin, mistaking fetal distress for divine ambition. In his arrogant, narrow mind, a child who kicked until her mother bruised was a born conqueror, a child who starved her vessel was disciplined. He had no idea that his supposed prodigy had simply strangled herself with her own lifeline. Next door, Madeline's thoughts, once a booming, manic monologue of entitlement, shrank into a thin, terrified whimper that scraped against the inside of my skull. Daddy, save me. I can't breathe. The cord, it's biting my throat. Why won't the light come? I'm supposed to be first. I'm supposed to be the billionaire. The psychic tether between us was vibrating with her panic. In my past life, that icy, suffocation-induced terror had been mine.
I remembered the exact
sensation of the umbilical cord tightening like a noose, the burning agony of meconium flooding tiny, unready lungs, the terrifying realization that my frantic ambition had built my own coffin. I felt no pity for her. Not a single drop. She had chosen this dance. She had mocked my mother's peace and sneered at my stillness. Richard? Eleanor's voice was faint, raw with heartbreak, but as the monitors next door wailed in flatline dissonance, her eyes snapped toward the shared
wall.
Richard didn't look at my mother. He didn't look at the papers.
With a face as
pale as curdled milk, he dropped the luxury fountain pen onto the bedsheets and bolted toward the corridor.
Isla.
Madeline, he bellowed, his polished facade shattering into pure hysteria. Save my daughter. Put the best surgeons on it. I don't care what it costs. The door swung back and forth on its heavy brass hinges, letting in the smell of antiseptic, copper blood, and panic. My mother sat alone on the edge of the motorized bed. Her hand hovered over the unsigned divorce papers. Her water had broken, warm fluid soaked through her linen gown, pooling on the mattress. Tears tracked through the sweat on her cheeks, but as she listened to her husband's desperate footsteps receding down the hall, abandoning his lawful wife and laboring child without a second glance, something inside Eleanor Sinclair broke. And in breaking, it hardened into diamond. Mom, I thought, pressing my tiny, fully formed heel against the wall of her womb, with a steady, rhythmic pressure. Not a violent thrash, not an erratic, suffocating flip. Just a firm, clear signal. I am here. I am strong. We do not need him. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her abdomen. For the past 9 months, she had lived in the shadow of Isla's theatrical pregnancy. She had watched Richard shower the mistress with diamond bracelets, bespoke nursery suites, and public adulation, while she had been instructed to stay quiet and keep out of the press. She had feared that her daughter was weak, lazy, or defective because I refused to perform like a circus monkey. Now, she felt the deep, centered strength of my descent. My heart was a steady
Tunderos drum.
140 beats per minute. Solid. Unyielding. Ready. Penelope? Eleanor whispered, her knuckles whitening as another contraction rolled through her hips. She looked down at the pen lying on the bed. She looked at the signature line, where Richard intended to strip us of our name, our dignity, and our rightful inheritance. With a slow, deliberate movement, Eleanor picked up the heavy legal packet.
She
Did not sign it. Instead, she took the thick, notarized pages in her trembling hands and tore them in two, then in four. She scattered the shredded parchment onto the floor like dirty confetti. Nurse, Eleanor called out, her voice no longer timid or pleading, but ringing with the authority of a woman who had finally remembered who she was. Call Dr. Vance. My daughter is coming. While the medical staff next door fought a bloody, chaotic battle in operating room 4, Eleanor was wheeled smoothly into delivery suite 1. There was no screaming. There was no terror. Because I had spent 40 weeks resting, storing glycogen, absorbing nutrients, and maintaining optimal fetal positioning, my entry into the world was textbook perfection. I had not wasted a single calorie on pointless uterine gymnastics. My lungs were fully matured, my limbs thick with healthy baby fat, my nervous system completely calm. Deep breath, Eleanor, Dr. Vance said, her voice steady and encouraging. You're fully dilated. On the next contraction, give me one long, smooth push. Eleanor gripped the leather handles of the delivery bed. She closed her eyes, drew the sterile air deep into her chest, and pushed. I did my part. With one strong, coordinated thrust from my healthy legs, I navigated the birth canal.
slide.
The blinding lights of the delivery room hit my closed eyelids. The chill of the outside air brushed against my skin. Cool, capable hands supported my head, cleared my airway, and before the doctor could even reach for the suction bulb, I opened my mouth and let out a deafening, full-chested roar. Wah wah. It wasn't a weak, gasping squeak. It was a brass fanfare. A primal declaration of survival. Look at those lungs. The head nurse laughed, beaming as she clamped and cut the pristine, untangled umbilical cord. APGAR score of 9 at 1 minute. Weight, 8 pounds 6 ounces. Eleanor, she is an absolute masterpiece. Warm towels enveloped me. Within seconds, I was laid directly onto my mother's
Body chest.
Eleanor was weeping, but these were not the bitter, humiliated tears she had cried in the luxury suite. These were tears of fierce, untamed triumph.
She
Wrapped her arms around my back, kissing my damp forehead, marveling at the flush of pink in my cheeks, the clarity of my dark blue eyes, and the sheer, unbothered weight of me. My brave girl, Eleanor whispered, her chin trembling against my crown.
my.
Sweet, clever Penelope. You stayed quiet just to save your strength for today,
Didn't you?
I let out a soft, milky sigh, buried my nose into her collarbone, and immediately went to sleep. My work in the womb was done. The Reaper's wisdom had held true, while the overachiever had sprinted into a brick wall. The one who laid flat had walked effortlessly through the golden gates. 20 minutes later, the double doors of the delivery ward banged open. Richard Sinclair stumbled through the hallway, his designer silk shirt stained with sweat and flecks of dark, arterial blood. Behind him shuffled my grandparents, their aged faces lined with horror and exhaustion. How is she? Richard barked, stepping into Eleanor's recovery room.
His eyes
Were bloodshot, his hair disheveled. He looked less like a corporate titan and more like a ruined gambler. Did you sign the papers? Where is the baby? Dr. Vance stepped between Richard and the bed, her face like stone. Mr. Sinclair, keep your voice down. Your wife has just delivered a perfectly healthy baby girl.
no complications.
Minimal blood loss. Mother and child are in optimal condition. Richard barely heard her. His gaze darted toward the bassinet beside Eleanor's bed, where I lay swaddled in organic cotton, sleeping like a little empress. Before he could approach, my grandmother, Evelyn Sinclair, a woman whose blood ran colder than liquid nitrogen, pushed past him. She marched straight to my crib, lowered her gold-rimmed spectacles, and inspected me like a jeweler, evaluating a raw gem. 8 pounds 6 ounces, Dr. Vance announced, intentionally projecting her
Voice.
APGAR score improved to a perfect 10 at 5 minutes. Sucking reflex is instantaneous.
No jaundice. No respiratory distress. Perfectly symmetrical. Skull.
Grandmother Evelyn reached down, touching my plump, rosy cheek. I didn't flinch. I merely let out a tiny, contented bubble and turned my head deeper into the pillow. Healthy, Evelyn declared, a sharp gleam returning to her eyes. Robust. This is what a Sinclair heir is supposed to look like. Richard, look at her skin.
Not
A blemish on her. Richard stepped forward, his mouth opening, but the door behind him swung open. Again, revealing the pediatric surgeon from OR.
4.
The surgeon looked as though he had just walked out of a combat zone. Mr. Sinclair, the surgeon said quietly, refusing to look Richard in the eye. We managed to stabilize Isla. She is in the ICU, but we had to perform an emergency hysterectomy to control the uterine rupture. Richard's face twitched. And Madeline, my prodigy? Where is she? The surgeon took a deep breath. The infant suffered severe intrauterine asphyxia. The umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck 3 times, knotted at the torso, and her early descent caused a prolapsed cord. When we delivered her, she had no pulse. We resuscitated her after 6 minutes of CPR. The room went dead silent. Even the air seemed to freeze. What does that mean? Richard hissed, his fingers digging into the edge of my
crib.
6 minutes? What are you saying? She has survived, but she is severely underweight, barely 3 pounds.
She
Suffered significant hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, brain swelling. Her lungs are stiff, and her motor cortex has sustained notable trauma. She is currently intubated in the level 4 NICU on whole-body hypothermia therapy. If she makes it through the week, she will likely face lifelong neurological and physical deficits. A choked sound escaped Richard's throat. He staggered back against the wall, clutching his head. All the prenatal gymnastics, the 5 in the morning backflips, the forced starvation for an aesthetic silhouette, the premature push-down and unripened cervix. Madeline had traded her health, her brain, and her mother's fertility for a burst of prenatal vanity. From the hallway, Isla's hysterical, sedated weeping began to drift down the corridor, muffled by the heavy doors. But inside my mother's room, the atmosphere shifted entirely. Grandfather Sinclair, who had not spoken a single word of sympathy to Eleanor for 9 months, turned his back on his son. He walked directly to Eleanor's bedside, pulled a solid gold heirloom signet ring from his pinky finger, and placed it gently inside my swaddle. The firstborn of the Sinclair lineage, the old man decreed, his voice echoing off the sterile walls. The only legitimate bloodline. Eleanor, you have done our family an immense service. Richard looked up, his face twisted in disbelief. Father, Madeline is my daughter too. She showed so much talent. She was dancing to Mozart. Shut up, Richard. Grandmother Evelyn snapped, her voice like a whip cracking. You let a common mistress starve an infant into brain damage and called it talent. Look at what you nearly threw away for a carnival trick. Evelyn turned back to me, stroking my forehead with a manicured finger. I didn't open my eyes. I didn't perform. I just let out a soft, tiny snore. The battle of the womb was over. The battle of the empire had just begun. The human brain is a fragile mechanism, particularly when deprived of oxygen. During the crucial moments of birth, for the first 6 months of our lives, the contrast between the Sinclair family nursery and the pediatric wing of the private hospital was a daily, humiliating slap in Richard Sinclair's face. Isla was discharged from the hospital 3 weeks after delivery, a broken, hollow shell of the glamorous mistress who had once paraded through luxury maternity boutiques. Her womb was gone, her pelvic floor was severely damaged from Madeline's premature descent, and her hair fell out in clumps from the sudden hormonal crash. Worst of all, Madeline was not the radiant, golden prodigy Isla had promised. Richard. When Madeline was finally released from the neonatal intensive care unit after 98 days of incubators, feeding tubes, and cranial cooling helmets, she looked like a fragile, translucent sparrow. Her limbs were stiff from spasticity, her cry was a high-pitched, neurological screech, and her digestive system, starved of amniotic nutrients during her prenatal diet, could barely tolerate specialized amino acid formula without projectile vomiting. Yet, deep within that damaged, struggling little body, Madeline's soul remained cursed with her past life ego. Because our nursery suites at the Sinclair Manor shared an adjoining balcony, I could still hear her frantic, broken thoughts buzzing through the air like a dying radio. I have to show Daddy. Must hold head up. Why won't my neck muscles work? Turn the flashcards. Isla, you stupid woman, show me the French flashcards.
I
Need to speak before Penelope. Every morning at 6, while the mist still hung over the Sinclair estates, sprawling manicured lawns, Isla would prop Madeline up on a velvet cushion in the sunroom, desperately waving high-contrast black and white cards and playing classical symphonies on high volume. Madeline would shake, her tiny, hypertonic fists clenched so tight her nails drew blood, trying with all her might to track the cards. But her optic nerves had been damaged by the oxygen deprivation. Her left eye drifted toward her nose. Within 10 minutes, the sheer neurological strain would trigger a grand mal seizure or a wave of violent colic, leaving Isla in tears and Madeline screaming, until her face turned purple. Richard would walk into the sunroom, coffee cup in hand, hoping for a miracle. He would look down at Madeline, drooling, twitching, her forehead perpetually bruised from uncontrolled spastic jerks, and his face would darken with profound disgust. Is this the prodigy? Richard would sneer, slamming his porcelain cup onto the silver tray. She can't even hold a rattle, Isla. She's 6 months old and she looks like an alien. I pay $50,000 a month for physical therapists, and she can't even look me in the eye. Richard, please, Isla would beg, kneeling on the Persian rug, clutching his trousers. The doctors say she just needs time. Her brain is neuroplastic. If we push her harder. I don't have time for damaged goods. Richard would bark, shaking her off. The Sinclair board meeting is next month. The shareholders are already whispering about my judgment. They think I'm a fool who traded a legitimate heir for a defective bastard. He would storm out, slamming the door so hard the crystal chandeliers rattled. Meanwhile, on the other side of the hall, my life was a masterclass in the ancient art of doing absolutely nothing. My mother, Eleanor, had completely transformed. The weeping, insecure wife had vanished the moment she realized she held the only winning card in the Sinclair dynasty. With the full backing of my grandparents, Eleanor hired the finest pediatric nutritionists, developmental pediatricians, and Montessori nannies in Europe, not to drill me but to pamper me. My daily routine was rigorous in its luxury. 7:30 a.m. Wake up naturally to the sound of birds in the garden. 8 a.m. Consume 8 ounces of rich, organic milk while resting on a silk bolster. 9 a.m. Stare lazily at the ceiling frescoes, contemplating the architectural symmetry of the 18th century moldings. 10 a.m. A gentle baby massage with cold-pressed almond oil, followed by a warm bath. 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. The imperial nap. I did not roll over early. I did not attempt to crawl at 4 months. When the developmental therapists came to evaluate me, I simply lay on my tummy, resting, my chubby chin on my crossed forearms, blinking slowly at their colorful toys. Is she delayed? Eleanor asked the lead pediatrician one afternoon, a hint of maternal anxiety in her voice. Dr. Vance chuckled warmly, gently tapping my knee to check my deep tendon reflexes. Delayed? Eleanor, look at her muscle tone. Her joints are supple, her spine is perfectly straight, and her responsiveness is razor sharp. She isn't rolling over because she has no need to roll over. Everything she wants is brought to her on a silver platter. She is conserving energy. Her cognitive baseline is astonishingly stable. To prove the doctor's point, Grandfather Sinclair walked into the nursery, unannounced. The old man, usually terrifying to the entire board of Sinclair Enterprises, carried a heavy gold pocket watch. He dangled the ticking antique in front of my face. Madeline would have lunged at it, spastically clawing and screaming to prove her desire for wealth. I didn't move an inch. I waited until the watch swung directly into my field of vision, reached out one plump, dimpled hand with laser precision, caught the heavy gold chain between 2 fingers, and pulled it smoothly into my lap. Then, I looked up at Grandfather, gave him a calm, aristocratic smirk, and put the gold watch right into my mouth to soothe my teething gums. Grandfather Sinclair froze. Then, to Eleanor's absolute shock, the stern patriarch threw his head back and roared with laughter. Look at that grip, the old man bellowed, slapping his knee. She doesn't scramble for crumbs. She waits for the fortune to come to her, takes it with one hand and bites into it. That is a true Sinclair. He immediately turned to Eleanor. Draft the trust fund papers. I am transferring the oceanfront estate in Monaco and 5% of Sinclair Maritime voting shares directly into Penelope's name. Today. From across the hallway, through the open balcony doors, I heard a sharp, psychic screech of pure, unadulterated rage. No, that's my estate. That's my stock. Grandfather, look at me. I can count to 10. A, B, C, D, cough, gag, vomit. The sound of Isla frantically calling for a suction pump echoed through the manor. I simply gummed the solid gold watch, closed my heavy eyelids, and drifted off into my afternoon slumber. Work smarter, not harder. And if you can manage it, don't work at all until the board of directors is watching. In high society, the 100th day celebration of an heir's birth is not a family party. It is an IPO of bloodlines. The Sinclair Grand Ballroom was drenched in white orchids, crystal candelabras, and the quiet, predatory hum of 500 billionaires, politicians, and media moguls. Everyone had come for one reason, to see which daughter would inherit the empire. Richard Sinclair had spent the last 2 weeks desperately preparing for this night. He knew his reputation had taken a severe beating after Isla's emergency delivery leaked to the press. To salvage his pride, he had concocted an insane plan to showcase Madeline's genius. He had dressed Madeline in a custom miniature Dior gown made of stiff, scratchy, metallic lace. To counteract her muscle weakness, her pediatric team had secretly fitted her with a rigid orthopedic brace hidden beneath the dress, forcing her spine upright. Isla had spent the entire morning rubbing numbing cream on Madeline's gums and feeding her low-dose stimulants prescribed by an unethical private doctor to keep her awake and alert. Tonight is my debut. Madeline's frantic thoughts bounced across the banquet hall. I will play the miniature grand piano. I will hit the keys. The whole world will see that Penelope is just a fat, useless blob. Daddy will announce me as the sole heir. I will crush her. I was sitting comfortably on Eleanor's lap at the head table. My mother looked breathtaking. She wore an emerald green silk velvet gown by Valentino, her neck draped in the Sinclair family heirloom emeralds that Richard had once tried to give to Isla. Eleanor was serene, radiant, and completely relaxed. I was dressed in a cloud-soft cashmere onesie, free of scratchy lace, metal wires, or restrictive boning. I had just consumed 7 ounces of warm milk and was happily observing the room, looking like a miniature, jade-carved Buddha. The banquet reached its climax when Richard stepped up to the mahogany podium, tapping his champagne glass with a silver knife. Distinguished guests, family, and partners, Richard began, projecting his most charismatic, dominant smile. Tonight, we celebrate the future of Sinclair.
Entity.
Many of you have heard rumors regarding the health and vitality of my 2 daughters. Tonight, the truth speaks for itself. He gestured grandly toward the side stage. Isla, trembling under heavy makeup that failed to hide her sunken cheekbones, carried Madeline onto the stage. A miniature, custom-built baby grand piano sat under a single spotlight. The crowd murmured. My youngest, Madeline, Richard announced with soaring pride, has demonstrated an unprecedented affinity for music. At just 3 months corrected age, she possesses the cognitive motor coordination to interact with classical
Composition.
Isla set Madeline down on the piano bench. The hidden orthopedic brace locked her tiny torso into place, holding her upright like a puppet. Isla took Madeline's stiff, spastic little hand and poised it over the ivory keys.
Play.
Madeline screamed in her mind. Play Beethoven. Hit the C major chord.
Show them.
Madeline forced her nervous system to fire. Her hypertonic arm jerked downward with violent, uncontrolled force. Clang bang smash. Her tiny knuckles slammed into the lower register keys, producing a discordant, ear-splitting screech through the ballroom's acoustic sound system. The guests winced. Several socialites covered their ears. Madeline tried to pull her hand back to strike another key, but the sheer physical strain on her damaged motor cortex triggered an immediate, catastrophic reflex. Her stiff little body went into a sudden extensor spasm. The rigid brace beneath her dress snapped with a sharp crack and Madeline pitched forward, her face smashing directly into the sharp edge of the black piano keys. Wail-F. A high-pitched, agonizing wail tore through the microphone.
Isla gasped, lunging
to grab her, but in her panic, she tripped on the hem of her gown, knocking the miniature piano off its stand. The instrument crashed onto the stage floor with a splintering thud. To make matters infinitely worse, the stimulants Isla had pumped into Madeline's fragile system chose that exact moment to violently evacuate her bowels. A dark, foul-smelling stain spread rapidly across the pristine metallic Dior gown, soaking through the silk and dripping onto the stage floor. Turn off the lights. Cut the feed. Richard roared, his face turning an apocalyptic shade of purple. Security, get them off the stage. The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers, muffled laughter, and the clicking of hidden cell phone cameras. Good heavens, did you see that? The child is clearly unwell. Richard has lost his mind, forcing a disabled infant to perform like a trained animal. Disgraceful, cruel, and the smell, utterly unrefined. Grandfather Sinclair stood up from the head table, his walking stick striking the marble floor with the force of a thunderclap. Enough of the circus, the patriarch spat, glaring at Richard with utter
contempt.
He turned toward Eleanor. Eleanor, bring Penelope to the podium. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She rose with regal poise, carrying me smoothly through the parted crowd of billionaires. She walked onto the main stage, completely ignoring the chaotic mess being scrubbed on the side platform, and stood beneath the central chandelier. The room fell dead silent. Everyone looked at me. I knew my cue. I didn't try to play a piano. I didn't try to do a backflip. I didn't try to recite the alphabet. Instead, I looked straight at Grandfather Sinclair, who had walked up the stage. Steps. I reached out both of my chubby, dimpled arms, grabbed his lapels, and let out a bright, clear, musical giggle that echoed through the ballroom like silver bells. Then, I rested my soft head against a stern, aristocratic shoulder and gave a long, contented sigh. The old man's weathered, ruthless face melted instantly. In front of the 500 most powerful people in the country, the terrifying patriarch of Sinclair Enterprises smiled, a genuine, warm, proud smile. He turned to face the room, holding me firmly against his chest. "This," Grandfather Sinclair announced, his voice ringing with absolute, unquestioned finality, "is Penelope Sinclair, the sole legitimate granddaughter of my line, the future of our house. And tonight I officially designate her as the primary beneficiary of the Sinclair Family Heritage Trust." The ballroom erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. Flashbulbs blinded the room. Billionaires and foreign diplomats raised their glasses in salute. From the backstage dressing room, Madeline's faint, agonized thoughts drifted through the applause, broken by hysterical sobs. Why her? I practiced. I worked so hard. I bled for this. Why does she get everything just for smiling? I didn't answer her. I simply closed my eyes, nuzzled deeper into my grandfather's bespoke wool suit, and went back to sleep. When you hold all the cards, darling, you don't need to perform tricks. You just let the audience applaud. By the time I turned 3 years old, the landscape of the Sinclair dynasty had shifted irrevocably. Eleanor was no longer the vulnerable woman who had wept in luxury maternity suites. Having secured the backing of the Sinclair elders and the unconditional adoration of Grandfather Sinclair, she executed a masterclass in strategic divorce. She did not scream. She did not create tabloid drama. She simply hired the top forensic accountants in the hemisphere and presented Richard with a dossier of every financial indiscretion, offshore tax shelter, and corporate embezzlement he had committed to fund Isla's private medical bills and failed luxury ventures. "Sign the settlement, Richard," Eleanor had said calmly across the boardroom table, sliding a leather-bound folder toward him. "You keep your CEO title for now, but you surrender 60% of your personal equity to Penelope's trust and you vacate the primary estate." Richard had aged 10 years in 36 months. His hairline had receded, his eyes were perpetually bloodshot from whiskey, and his hands shook. "Eleanor, please," Richard had rasped, his voice devoid of its former arrogance. "Madeline needs private stem cell therapies in Switzerland. It costs millions every quarter. If you take this equity, Madeline is your responsibility, not the Sinclair Corporation's," Eleanor interrupted coldly. "You wanted a prodigy, Richard. You traded your family for her. Now go raise her." Richard signed. That evening, Eleanor, Grandfather Sinclair, and I moved our primary residence to the Sinclair Crown Villa in Greenwich, a 40-acre sanctuary of rolling green lawns, private stables, and classical libraries. Meanwhile, Richard moved Isla and Madeline into a sterile, gated modern compound in suburban New Jersey, which quickly devolved into a private torture chamber of Madeline's own making. Because my psychic connection to Madeline had not completely faded, it seemed our shared womb experience had left a lingering psychic resonance. I could periodically tune into her chaotic existence. Madeline refused to accept her physical reality. Her cerebral palsy had left her with a permanent limp in her right leg and limited fine motor control in her right hand. Instead of following gentle physical therapy to adapt and heal, she drove herself into a state of manic, toxic overcompensation. "I am a genius," she would scream in her mind every single day, sitting in her specialized wheelchair. "I will master the stock market. I will memorize the dictionary. I will be admitted to Harvard at 10 years old. Father will see that I am superior to that lazy cow Penelope." She forced Isla to hire ruthless academic tutors who drilled her from 5 a.m. until midnight. If she couldn't write with her right hand, she forced herself to type with her left until her knuckles bled. If she forgot a historical date, she would bite her own forearm until it bruised. Isla, now completely dependent on Madeline's genius to keep Richard's financial support flowing, became her daughter's enabler and warden. The two of them fed on each other's paranoia and bitterness, turning their home into an echo chamber of desperation. And what was I doing in Greenwich? I was living the supreme life of leisure. I spent my mornings learning to ride gentle Shetland ponies across the estate meadows. I spent my afternoons painting abstract watercolors with Eleanor, splashing vibrant blues and golds onto giant canvases without a care in the world. When my grandparents hired elite tutors for me, I did not grind. I did not memorize textbooks like a parrot, because my brain had developed with zero trauma, zero hypoxia, and optimal nutrition. My cognitive architecture was terrifyingly efficient. I had what neurologists call hyperfluid intelligence. I didn't need to study a language. For 10 hours, I simply listened to a native French speaker for 2 weeks and absorbed the syntax effortlessly, like water soaking into dry earth. One afternoon, when I was 7, Grandfather Sinclair sat in the library, reviewing the quarterly earnings report for Sinclair Maritime. He was rubbing his temples, scowling at a complex supply chain logistics bottleneck caused by rising fuel tariffs in the Mediterranean. I was lying on the Persian rug beside his leather armchair, lazily coloring a picture of a sailboat. "Grandpa," I said softly, not even looking up from my crayons. "Yes, my little jewel," the old man replied, his voice softening instantly. "Why don't you just reroute the grain cargo through the port of Piraeus?"
I
asked, shading the sailboat's hull in bright crimson. "The Greek port fees are 40% lower this quarter because of their new maritime subsidy, and their rail network connects directly to the Central European distribution hub." Grandfather froze. The papers in his hands trembled. He stared down at me. "Penelope, where did you read about Greek maritime subsidies?" "I didn't read it." I yawned, rolling onto my back and stretching like a lazy
cat.
"You left the European Logistics Journal on the breakfast table yesterday." I looked at the graphs while eating my pancakes. "It's pretty obvious, isn't it?" Grandfather stared at me for a full 2 minutes. Then he picked up his private phone and called his chief operating officer. "Implement the Piraeus reroute immediately," the old man commanded. That single, casual observation saved Sinclair Maritime $42 million in Q3. That was the difference between Madeline and me. Madeline was an engine burning dirty coal, grinding its gears to dust to produce a faint puff of smoke. I was a supercomputer running on standby, solving quantum equations while taking an afternoon nap. By the time we were 16, the contrast between the legitimate daughter of the Sinclair dynasty and the illegitimate shadow in New Jersey had become national news. Madeline had forced Richard to spend millions on public relations campaigns, branding her as the miracle prodigy. She had graduated from an online high school at 14 through sheer, brutal, rote memorization, and Richard had used his remaining corporate connections to buy her spot in the undergraduate economics department at an elite private university. She wore thick foundation to cover the dark circles under her hollow eyes, walked with a carbon fiber cane that she desperately tried to disguise as a fashion statement, and took dangerous doses of prescription stimulants to maintain her 18-hour study schedule. She was scheduled to participate in the National Collegiate Financial Analytics Olympiad, a prestigious, televised competition sponsored by the country's top investment banks. Madeline saw this as her final, ultimate coronation. "This is it," her thoughts hissed across the miles, vibrating with a toxic, manic frequency. "The whole world will watch. I will solve the macroeconomic model faster than anyone in history." Penelope didn't even skip a grade. She's just a normal high school senior. She's nothing. When I win the gold medal, the board of Sinclair Enterprises will have no
Choice.
They will demand that father make me CEO. The competition was held at the Grand Hall of the Metropolitan Financial Center in Manhattan. Over 2,000 industry leaders, venture capitalists, and media outlets filled the auditorium. Richard and Isla sat in the front row of the VIP section. Isla was wrapped in a synthetic fur coat, her face pulled tight from cheap cosmetic surgeries, while Richard nervously checked his phone, looking like a man standing on the edge of a cliff. Richard's personal hedge fund was hemorrhaging capital, he had staked his entire remaining reputation on Madeline winning this competition and attracting institutional investors. Eleanor and Grandfather Sinclair were also in attendance, seated in the presidential box above the auditorium floor. I was sitting next to my mother, dressed in an understated navy blue silk blouse and tailored trousers, holding a cup of iced chamomile tea, casually scrolling through architectural designs for an eco-resort I was planning to build in Bali. "Contestants, take your podiums," the master of ceremonies announced. Madeline limped onto the stage, leaning heavily on her cane, her knuckles white. Her face was gaunt, her eyes manic and hyper-focused. When she saw me sitting in the presidential box, her lips curled into a sneer of pure hatred. The challenge was unveiled on the massive LED screens, a live, real-time macroeconomic crisis simulation. The contestants were given 15 minutes to analyze 40 years of simulated market data, identify an imminent systemic banking collapse, and draft a quantitative hedging model to prevent total liquidity failure. The countdown began.
Tick, tick, tick.
Madeline went into a frenzy. Her left hand flew across the specialized keyboard. At blinding speed, she was rattling off memorized formulas from textbooks, forcing complex mathematical algorithms into the interface, trying to overwhelm the simulation with sheer computational brute force.
"I know this,"
she screamed in her head. Page 402 of the IMF Macroeconomic Handbook. Dynamic stochastic general equilibrium. Solve for variable x. I am the smartest. I am the chosen one. Sweat poured down her temples, melting her thick makeup into streaks. Her breathing became shallow, wheezing through her underdeveloped lungs. Her right hand began to spasm uncontrollably from the sheer neurological stress, but she ignored it, hammering the keys with her left fist. 10 minutes passed. Madeline slammed the red submit button. Contestant Sinclair Vance has submitted her model in record time. The Announcer shouted. Richard jumped to his feet in the front row, cheering wildly. That's my daughter. That's my genius. The panel of 5 Nobel laureate judges stared at the screen where Madeline's model was being processed by the supercomputer. For 3 seconds, the model showed a massive green spike. Madeline stood on stage, panting, raising her chin in arrogant triumph, looking up at me in the box. Look at me, Penelope. Bow before me. I won. Then, the screen turned bright, flashing crimson. Critical systemic collapse. Liquidity, 0. Total capital destruction. The supercomputer's automated voice echoed through the hall. Model failure. Overleveraged algorithmic loop detected. The submitted hedge accelerated the banking collapse by 400%. The auditorium went dead silent. The head judge, a renowned Swiss central banker, adjusted his microphone. His voice was cold and devastating. Miss Sinclair Vance, the judge said, your model is a catastrophic disaster. You simply copy-pasted advanced textbook formulas without understanding the fundamental human psychology driving the panic. You applied a linear equation to a chaotic, non-linear human crisis. In a real market, your strategy would have triggered a national depression within 48 hours. Madeline's face turned gray. No. The math is correct. I memorized the theorem. I studied 18 hours a day. Check it again. Mathematics without conceptual comprehension is just noise. The judge dismissed her coldly. Madeline stood frozen on stage. The stimulant crash, combined with the sudden surge of adrenaline and public humiliation, was too much for her fragile, oxygen-deprived nervous system. Her right leg buckled. The carbon fiber cane slipped from her fingers, clattering across the stage. She collapsed into an undignified heap on the floor, gasping for air, her eyes rolling back as a mild focal seizure gripped her face. Madeline, Isla screamed, scrambling toward the stage. Security guards rushed forward. The cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every second of the prodigy's total, humiliating disintegration on live television. Up in the presidential box, the master of ceremonies looked up at her balcony with a desperate expression. The event was falling apart on live broadcast. Miss Penelope Sinclair, the host, called out through the sound system. As the designated alternate for the youth delegation, would you care to review the simulation? Eleanor looked at me. Grandfather smiled. I set my iced chamomile tea down on the silver saucer. I walked to the balcony railing, where a remote microphone had been placed. I didn't rush. I didn't sweat. I didn't even walk down to the stage. I looked at the chaotic data streams on the massive LED screen for exactly 5 seconds. The model is asking the wrong question, I said, my voice calm, smooth, and resonant, carrying effortlessly through the hushed hall. The judges looked up, intrigued. Explain, Miss Sinclair. You are treating the liquidity crisis as an asset pricing problem, I explained, casually, leaning my forearms against the velvet railing. It isn't. It's an information asymmetry problem. The regional banks aren't insolvent, they're terrified of counterparty default. If you simply suspend the mark-to-market accounting rule on sovereign bonds for 72 hours and inject a targeted temporary repurchase facility at the discount window, the interbank lending rate drops automatically by 180 basis points. The panic stops. No capital injection required. The Swiss judge stared at me.
He typed 3 commands into his console to
simulate the parameters. The giant screen flashed. Market stabilized. Volatility index, minus 65%. Total cost to treasury, $0. A collective gasp swept through the 2,000 financial titans in the room. The head judge stood up from his table. Slowly, deliberately, he began to applaud. Within seconds, the entire auditorium rose in a deafening standing ovation. Down on the floor, being lifted onto a medical stretcher by paramedics, Madeline opened her heavy, bloodshot eyes. She looked up at me, standing bathed in the warm, golden light of the presidential box, receiving the adoration of the entire financial world without having broken a single drop of sweat. Her psychic voice, once so loud and full of venom, was barely a fading whisper. How did you do that without studying? It's not fair. I looked down at her from the heights, met her gaze for the first time in 16 years, and sent a single, clear thought back through the ether. You turned your life into a war against your own body just to win a prize that was never meant for you. Rest, Madeline. You were dead the moment you tried to sprint before you could breathe. Madeline closed her eyes and wept as the paramedics wheeled her away into the darkness of the backstage corridor. The televised disaster at the Metropolitan Financial Center was the final nail in the coffin of Richard Sinclair's financial empire. Institutional investors pulled their capital from his hedge fund within 48 hours. Creditors called in their margin loans. The board of Sinclair Enterprises, thoroughly disgusted by the public spectacle and empowered by Grandfather Sinclair, officially voted to strip Richard of his remaining executive titles, and expelled him from the family trust. Desperate to avoid complete bankruptcy, Richard made one last, catastrophic gamble. He listened to Madeline, confined to a wheelchair and consumed by an all-consuming desire to destroy Eleanor and me. Madeline convinced Richard to pour his remaining $60 million of personal liquid wealth into a high-leveraged short position against Sinclair Maritime's upcoming transatlantic expansion. Penelope is heading the expansion project. Madeline had rasped from her sickbed, her face gaunt, her eyes burning with feverish spite. She's lazy. She doesn't know how to manage shipping contracts. The supply chains will fail, the stock will crater, and our short position will make us $300 million. We will buy back Sinclair Enterprises and kick them out. Richard, blinded by greed and having nowhere else to turn, executed the trade. He didn't know that I had spent the last 6 months doing what I did best, letting other people do the heavy lifting while I positioned the pieces. I hadn't managed the shipping contracts myself. I had hired the 3 top maritime logistics directors from Maersk and given them complete operational freedom, backed by a proprietary AI routing software developed by an MIT startup. I had quietly funded with my trust fund dividends. On the day the short contracts expired, Sinclair Maritime announced record-breaking quarterly profits, a zero-emission transatlantic corridor, and an exclusive 10-year logistics contract with the European Union. The stock didn't crater. It surged by 42% in pre-market trading. Richard Sinclair was wiped out. Completely. Irrevocably. His margin calls exceeded $80 million. The banks seized his New Jersey compound, his luxury vehicles, his private art collection, and his offshore accounts. At 52 years old, the man who had once arrogantly tossed divorce papers onto his laboring wife's bed was left with nothing but a mountain of unpayable debt and a ruined reputation. A week later, the rain was pouring over the Sinclair Crown Villa in Greenwich. Eleanor and I were sitting in the glass-walled conservatory, enjoying afternoon tea and freshly baked scones. Eleanor was reviewing the architectural blueprints for a new pediatric hospital wing she was funding, her face serene, beautiful, and untouched by age. The butler stepped into the conservatory, bowing slightly. "Madam Eleanor, Miss Penelope. Mr. Richard Sinclair is at the front security gate. He is demanding to see you." Eleanor set her porcelain teacup down without a sound. "Let him walk up the drive." 10 minutes later, Richard stood in the doorway of the conservatory. The contrast between the past and the present was brutal. He was drenched to the bone. His cheap suit was soaked with rainwater, his shoes were caked with mud, and his face was hollow, gray, and trembling. Behind him, pushed by a hired orderly who looked embarrassed to be there, sat Madeline in her wheelchair. She was wrapped in a faded wool blanket, her body withered, her left hand clutching her useless right wrist. Isla followed behind, carrying 2 cheap canvas duffel bags, her face devoid of any makeup, looking like a ghost haunting the ruins of her own vanity. "Eleanor," Richard choked out, his voice cracking as he fell to his knees on the polished marble floor. "Penelope, please." Eleanor didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her Earl Grey tea. "You are dripping dirty rainwater onto my Persian rugs, Richard." "Eleanor, have mercy," Richard sobbed, pressing his palms against the cold floor. "The bailiffs took the house. Isla and Madeline have nowhere to go. Madeline needs round-the-clock medical care, and the private clinic cancelled her insurance. I have nothing left. I am your husband." "You are my husband," Eleanor corrected him, her voice as smooth and lethal as chilled vodka. "Until you walked into my delivery suite with divorce papers. While our daughter was fighting to be born." Richard flinched as if struck by a physical blow. He turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward me. "Penelope, my firstborn, my brilliant daughter," he cried, crawling forward on his knees. "I am your father. You have billions in your trust. You have the entire Sinclair empire. You can't let your own father starve in the streets. Look at your sister. She is your own flesh and blood." I set my teacup down. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my cashmere skirt, and walked slowly toward them. I stopped 3 feet from Madeline's wheelchair. Madeline looked up at me. There was no arrogance left in her eyes. No manic ambition. No grand illusions of being the chosen heir. There was only the cold, crushing realization of a life completely wasted on envy. "You knew," she projected weakly, a tear cutting through the dust on her cheek. "In the womb, when you stopped moving, you knew this would happen." I looked down at her, my expression calm, peaceful, and entirely free of hatred. "I didn't know the future, Madeline." I spoke aloud, my voice gentle. "I simply knew the fundamental rule of existence. The universe does not reward frantic desperation. You tried to conquer the world before you even had lungs to breathe. It's air. You thought effort without wisdom was a virtue. You destroyed your vessel before the journey even began." Madeline buried her face in her withered hands and let out a broken, shuddering sob. I turned to Richard. "You wanted an heir who would dance for your ego, I said coldly. You wanted a circus animal to validate your vanity. You threw away a healthy child and a loyal wife for a mirage. You made your bed, Richard. Now you will sleep in it. Penelope, please, Richard wailed, grabbing at the hem of my skirt. I stepped back, out of his reach. Butler, Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with absolute finality. Call the local social services for Mr. Sinclair and his companions. Provide them with standard emergency housing vouchers and a one-way bus ticket to the municipal district. Then, have the security team escort them off the property.
No.
Eleanor, Penelope. The security guards moved in with swift, professional efficiency. They lifted Richard from the floor, turned Madeline's wheelchair around, and escorted the weeping, broken remnants of Richard's ambition out into the torrential rain. The heavy mahogany doors of the estate closed with a solid, echoing thud. The conservatory was silent once more, save for the gentle patter of raindrops against the glass roof. Eleanor let out a long, quiet breath. She looked at me, a soft, radiant smile, returning to her lips. More tea, darling? My mother asked. Yes, please, Mom. I smiled, sitting back down on the plush velvet sofa.
And
pass the scones, would you? I think I'm going to take a very long nap this afternoon. 10 years later, the private island of St. Bartholomew was bathed in the warm, lavender hues of a Caribbean sunset. Aboard the 300-foot superyacht the Eleanor, I lay comfortably on a wide, cushioned sunbed on the top deck, wearing an oversized straw hat and dark sunglasses, listening to the gentle lapping of the turquoise waves against the hull. I was 28 years old. I was the majority shareholder and chairwoman of the Sinclair Global Trust, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise spanning green energy, sovereign logistics, and philanthropic medical research. I didn't work 80-hour weeks. I didn't scream at subordinates in boardrooms. I had built an executive committee of brilliant, highly compensated professionals who managed daily operations with ruthless efficiency. My job consisted of reviewing one strategic dossier per month, signing 3 executive authorizations, and spending the rest of my time traveling the world, collecting art, and living in total, unbothered peace. Eleanor was sitting beside me, laughing as she spoke on the phone with Grandfather Sinclair, who, at 88 years old, was still happily tending to his orchid greenhouse in Greenwich, completely retired from corporate stress. My personal assistant, a sharp young woman named Clara, walked up the deck stairs, holding a slim leather folder. Chairwoman Sinclair, Clara said respectfully, the quarterly report on the Sinclair Charitable Foundation's municipal assistance programs has arrived. There is an update regarding the individuals you requested we monitor. Go ahead, Clara, I said, lifting my sunglasses slightly. Richard Sinclair passed away last month in a state-subsidized care facility in Ohio. Cirrhosis of the liver. Isla Vance left him 6 years ago and is currently working as a night shift clerk at a motel in Nevada. And Madeline? I asked softly. Madeline Vance is residing in a specialized assisted living community funded anonymously by your foundation, Clara replied. She receives daily physical therapy and full medical coverage. Her condition is stable. According to the medical director, she has stopped trying to read textbooks. She spends her afternoons in the community garden, sitting in the sun, listening to the birds. I paused, looking out toward the endless, shimmering horizon where the turquoise sea met the golden sky. For the first time in 28 years, I reached out with my mind, casting a gentle, silent thought across the thousands of miles of ocean. The mental space was quiet. The frantic, manic buzz of envy was entirely gone. In its place, I felt a faint, peaceful ripple, a soul that had finally, after a lifetime of pointless torment, learned how to let go. Rest well, sister, I thought. A soft, faint whisper echoed back through the ether, light as a falling leaf. Thank you, Penelope. I closed the leather folder and handed it back to Clara. Ensure the foundation continues to cover all her medical expenses. Indefinitely. I instructed gently. Of course, Chairwoman. Clara bowed and walked down the deck. The warm Caribbean breeze brushed across my face, carrying the scent of sea, salt, jasmine, and absolute freedom. I took a slow sip of freshly squeezed passion fruit juice, leaned my head back against the silk pillows, and closed my eyes. In my first life, I had raced toward death, believing that the world belonged to those who struggled the hardest. In this life, I had discovered the greatest truth of all. The empire does not belong to the one who runs until their lungs burst. It belongs to the one who knows when to sit still, breathe deep, and let the world lay its treasures at their feet. I pulled my straw hat down over my eyes, listened to the rhythm of the ocean, and went peacefully to sleep.